Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm Washington editor-at-large of The Atlantic magazine, and it's a real pleasure to be here at Washington College. I've enjoyed so many forums here at the college. I find that this institution on the Eastern Shore plays so highly above its weight, and it's about to go a lot higher. I've had the privilege of knowing your next president, I guess your president now, about to be inaugurated in a series of events. This is really the formal opening of a set of inaugural festivities for Sheila Bair as the 28th president of Washington College. We're going to have a fun discussion in a minute, and I just want to tell Hank Paulson that he was the 74th Treasury Secretary. It's about the same time, you know. So there's the tenure here for Washington College presidents is much better than Treasury Secretaries. We have just a wonderful program that's going to take place, and I don't know where my esteemed and wonderful colleague, John Harwood, I'm going to say a few words about John, is going to take the discussion. But I do want to set the stage for a moment of where part of the discussion should be, because in many ways, the global economy, and certainly the American economy, came to a brink over which, if things had gone where they were going without the interaction, without the debate between at least two of the people here and others, we probably wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be dressed well. We wouldn't have the comfort that we have to sort of think big thoughts and ask these questions, because these were very, very unnerving times in the fall of 2008. We're in a presidential season now, but we're not really even in 2016 yet. Imagine you're right before the election. You're 2008. You have an outgoing president, President George W. Bush, and you have people like John McCain and Barack Obama with all sorts of currents swelling around what that may mean. And in the middle of that, Hank Paulson is looking at data and an implosion, an imminent implosion of the American financial system and potentially the global financial system, and basically begins to pull things together. It's an extraordinary moment. We have with us today, of course, Henry Hank Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury. He was chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs. He did really well there. We got to know how well he did when he had to sell all of his stock before he became Secretary of the Treasury. He was an Eagle Scout. He was born in Palm Beach, but he was raised on a farm in Barrington, Illinois. He helped do extraordinary things when he was there, not just saving all of our bank accounts and trying to steady and basically create railroad tracks into the Obama administration where responsible stewardship would take over after the sacrifices and compelling requests that he made on what needed to be done to sort of safeguard the U.S. economy. But he also, as I'm carrying around a book that I'm midway through here, invested heavily and reoriented America's relationship with China. I'm going to say a few words about Sheila in a moment, but both of them represent a very different order. They are sort of the Henry Kissingers in the economic era. You know, when you think about Brent Scowcroft, Henry Kissinger, Zbig Brzezinski, names we know from the national security arena, one of the problems and criticisms I had of Henry Kissinger over the years, that in his day when he thought about national security and foreign policy, economics often didn't come into that. Economics is also power. Economic attainment, economic growth, the solvency of an economic system is a very different way to think about the throw weight of a nation, what a nation can achieve. And so these two people that John Harwood is going to be having a conversation with are really the two of the ones who understood that power, the way it has to be managed in institutions, what the checks and balances ought to be, in a way that is equally important, if not more important, than the traditional national security people that we had that we've known so much about. You know, I was reading the other day Faulkner's Sound and Fury. I recently moved homes and I put an old copy, dusty copy of my 1977 reprint of A Sound and the Fury, and it reminded me of incidents of rich families that began to deteriorate, that had financial hardship, and Faulkner tells the story of a family that goes through that from 4 or 5 different perspectives, if those of you who are familiar with that. When you read Sheila Bair's amazing book that I fell in love with, Bull by the Horns, and her story, her anecdotes, you know, one of the two things that are very similar about Hank Paulson and Sheila Bair is they're probably the two wonkiest people in finance and economics who are best with vignettes and human stories. They're fun to read. They're the only only two people in finance who are fun to read in the world. And but you read them, then you read Tim Geithner's book, not quite as good as Hank's. Hank Paulson's On the Brink. You have other books that are out there that tell this story of this extraordinary episode, particularly in September and October of 2008, when really the wheels were coming off the track. I just want to say that because there was a very famous meeting where Hank Paulson had sort of, according to Sheila, peremptorily summoned 9 of the biggest banking and finance players in town. This was Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, JPM Chase's, Jamie Dimon, Citigroup's Vikram Pandit, others, Merrill Lynch's John Thain. And she tells the story in a very interesting way that here were these 9 men who she was trying to avoid chit-chatting with and avoiding handshakes. So for those of you who are going to work with Sheila, remember that. Not high on handshakes or chit-chat. But she was trying to avoid that, and then a CEO came over to her and tried to warm her up a little bit. And she realized that she was on a slippery slope to basically getting cornered in this. But you saw someone who was then, Sheila Bair, heading the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, who was in a way being cornered by circumstances. And that's what makes this interesting, because the cornerer was in part Hank Paulson, also Tim Geithner involved, and so you guys were rivals. And I love this, this quote by Paulson about Sheila Bair. It says, I respected Sheila. It's kind of like, you know, Barack Obama to Hillary Clinton. Yeah, she's nice enough. And Paulson said, I respected Sheila, but sometimes she said things that made my jaw drop. That morning, she had said she wasn't sure that Citi's failure would constitute a systemic risk, the threshold for extraordinary federal action. She spoke as if Citi were just another failing bank and not a world leader with $3 trillion in assets, imploding in the midst of the worst economic conditions since the Great Depression. Although I believe she was simply posturing, I replied, if Citi isn't systemic, I don't know what is. I mean, I want to give a little tension to this wonderful conversation that John Paulson is going to conduct. Just a real quick profile of your new president here at Washington College. She was, as I said, she is now the 28th president of Washington College. She was the 19th chair of the FDIC, which was founded in 1933. Born in Independence, Kansas. She didn't know me then, but I feared her in the United States Senate in the 1990s. She was Bob Dole's counsel. Of course, she was Senator Bob Dole's counsel in the Senate. I had the pleasure of working for Jeff Bingaman in the 1990s in the Senate, and we all knew that Sheila Bair was not someone to be trifled with, and it was always good to be on her good side, and I always was, to my knowledge. She was the Dean's Professor of Financial and Regulatory Policy at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, an Assistant Secretary of Financial Institutions at the Department of Treasury, an Senior Vice President for Government Relations at the New York Stock Exchange, on and on and on, an Acting Chair of the Commodities Future Trading Commission. There are few people, not to mention men or women, who have held such a consistent line of responsible and important positions across government within the area of financial and economic stewardship. And what Sheila did to structurally change this notion of banks and financial institutions being too big to fail, she changed it. She changed the net and the control factors that the FDIC had over potential future crises. She bent the universe to change the game on what that meant, because behind that notion of too big to fail, which was one of the biggest debates, was a profound degree of structural corruption hiding behind it. And she dragged that structural corruption right out into the public, showed it, and became a hero to people around the United States. So homeowners, mortgage holders that were underwater, all of a sudden their hero was Sheila Bair. And the enemies of Wall Street bailed out another. Those are more of Hank Paulson's friends. So we're gonna kind of get into this. But Hank Paulson, to his credit, took on his party, took on people in the Wall Street. This was not a great time. Allegedly got on his knees and said you could not, then begged for the passage of the Troubled Assets Relief Program, and began to get this country in a different deal, went against I mean, it's very hard to imagine a Hank Paulson today in this climate succeeding, because there is such a great divide and division. Hank Paulson may be the last person that was able to bridge that divide in such an extraordinary crisis. He changed as I said, American policy with China. Very important, opening up and creating the strategic and economic dialogue. He just hosted Xi Jinping in Seattle through the Paulson Institute, which he established in Chicago. A very important meeting. He had people of the likes of Tim Cook of Apple and others meeting with him. I was reading about this today. And he's become, I heard him give a speech. He doesn't know that I was in the audience listening to every word. At SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies, a few years ago in Washington, D.C. And it was essentially the outline not only of a healthier, better China that was engaged in sustainable development, which meant dealing with climate change, that dealt with responsible governance, that respond. I mean, he sounded a lot like Sheila Bair, like he's taking Sheila Bair's stuff and applying it to China. It was an extraordinary outline of what his plans were before this book was written and before he established the Paulson Institute. He is also one of the world's great gladiators in the sense that he's been able to change the universe and to sort of change the system and was there at a vital moment. I recommend these books, that will give you sort of a moment and a different perspective because it shows you how important Washington can be. You know, most places despise and detest Washington, D.C., but when you read On the Brink and you read Bull by the Horns, authored by these two incredible financial gladiators, you will get an understanding of why the decisions there matter so much to the lives everywhere else. John Harwood, of course, we all know as someone whose father taught here. His father, Richard Harwood, was a very distinguished political reporter, came here to the Eastern Shore, taught at Washington College, and now John helps run the Harwood Forum, Richard Harwood Forum, and brings in distinguished personalities to the Washington College scene. It was fun. I'll never forget when I met Karl Rove via John here. I was fighting John Bolton's nomination from the Bush administration as ambassador to the United Nations at the time. I just didn't think it was a good move. And Rove came up to me and hit me on the shoulder and says, "We're going to check off that box." And I hit him right back and said, "No, you're not." And John Bolton never got confirmed. But I did have that opportunity by way of John Harwood. He is, of course, chief correspondent for CNBC. He's a political writer for the New York Times. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky. He was for a long time Wall Street Journal's chief political correspondent, political editor. You may have seen him in past presidential debates. He's covered 8 presidential elections regularly on NBC Nightly News and PBS Washington Week in Review. And he has this really cool digital interview series. And what do we call it? Speakeasy with John Harwood? And it's going to have Jeb Bush tomorrow. And I just saw a 2-minute vignette. And it's really cool. And I've seen a number of these other short vignettes with presidential candidates, all of them. They're like 19 left, or I don't know how many. But John is trying his best to sit down and have these easygoing, no-tie exchanges that are very brief. And he puts them on the spot. And there's a surprising one with Jeb Bush, which will appear on his website tomorrow morning. So without further ado, please allow me to call to the stage Sheila Bair, your 28th president of Washington College, Hank Paulson, our former Secretary of the Treasury, and John Harwood.
Oh!
Oops.
That was terrific. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Mic's working? Well, you just heard all of that fluff from Steve for these two titans of the political establishment. And I just thought that given what we've heard in the presidential campaign so far, there's only one fair way for me to start this conversation. We've heard from the leading Republican candidate for president that the reason that Americans have experienced flat wage growth and sort of indifferent economic growth is because the people who've been running our government in recent years are stupid. So I just want to give each of you the opportunity to either apologize or defend yourself.
Well, I don't want to endorse anything that particular candidate says, but I think one thing is very true, that the United States, like many other countries in the world, we have policies today that used to work and that don't work in the modern world. And so I think part of the reason why we have, we're stagnant, we have 2% growth, and is that our government's not working. And I think if we want to restore our competitiveness, it's going to take fundamental tax reform. It's going to take a different approach to managing our fiscal situation and dealing with our entitlements. And I happen to believe everybody has their theories about income disparity and what's happened. But if you take a look, to go back to the crisis, at the 10 years before the crisis, the bubble years, the average income in the United States of America, the median income was flat. And so what had happened was the average American had doubled their borrowing much more than they could afford, to try to live at a level which they really couldn't afford. And and the bubble covered up sort of the structural issues. And I think the structural issues are largely, if you look at income disparity, I think the biggest reason, because people can debate this, is what's happening with technology. And so much, almost everything that can be routinized is now. And in profession after profession after profession, the middle is getting carved out. It's sort of winner take all at the top. And again, we haven't changed our education system. We haven't changed our skill training. And so the fact is, this country is doing better than virtually every other major country. We have fewer problems because we've got such a diverse, strong economy. Businesses are better run than they've ever been, but our government hasn't done the job in terms of changing the policies that need to be changed.
Let me just say, first of all,
And that's why these people run, because I took 5 minutes to say something that no one understands. And if someone says government's stupid and that's why we're in trouble, he may be right. But maybe there's some structural issues too.
I will just say, from my perspective, that didn't sound like a stupid answer. And it seems to me that if you keep coming back to Washington College and giving answers of that caliber, you never know, someday you might get an honorary degree or something. Sheila, let me put this question to you that's related to what Hank was just talking about. Leave aside the crash that we had. Bubble, crash, Great Recession, recovery. Since then, before then, we've had sort of indifferent growth, very poor wage growth over 40 years, really. When you think about what the United States could do to lift the economic prospects of ordinary people, does it involve government doing more or less?
I think it involves government changing what it's been doing. I agree with Hank that I think we're stuck in the rut of old policies that just don't work anymore. I think, and I would, I think monetary policy is misguided in the sense that it tries to default to the old paradigm that's not sustainable of getting people to borrow to stimulate growth by making credit cheap. But even if you make it cheap to borrow, if they don't have real wage growth to sustain that, eventually you're going to get yourself into trouble again. I think the tax code contributes to income inequality. We tax labor income and investment income at very different tax rates, and people of goodwill can disagree with that, but the impact is that, the manager of a hedge fund probably has a lower tax rate than the manager of a shoe store. So I think...
Well, let me ask a specific on that. Do you believe, and I want you to follow up also, because this is something I talked to Jeb Bush about in this interview that's going to be out tomorrow. He has a tax plan that reduces the top individual rate down to 28%. That's where it was when Ronald Reagan had his tax reform. But he takes the rate for capital gains and for corporations down to 20%. Mm-hmm. And he told me, I think it's a close call, and I understand the argument that you tax labor income the same as investment income, but the reason I came down the way I did was our biggest imperative right now is to create as much economic growth as we can. That's the key to wage growth. That's why I did it. Is that a good argument? Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think that confuses investment income with the corporate tax code, which I agree is a mess, and it dampens economic growth. What we did in '86, back when I was working with the Senate, is that they, I think we took the top rate down to 28 for both. So we took the top rate down, but we equalized
There
it
was
for
no
both.
differential.
I mean, it contributes to income inequality, but it injects horrible complexity to the tax code, because it's very difficult sometimes to differentiate between investment income and labor income. So you have all these complex rules.
You think
and
they
have
should
a lot
be
of
the same?
financial. Absolutely.
Do you agree?
Do I what?
Do you think that the tax rate on capital gain should be the same as on ordinary
With the
income?
caveat, I
Well,
think that
see,
the top rate should be lowered.
See, I believe that our tax system has got all kinds of problems in it, and the complexity, all kinds of distortionary types of things. Now, I believe that if you tax something, you get less of it. I think we need less and we need more investment. So I would have a lower rate on capital gains. But what I think Sheila's getting at, it's this carried interest, this thing that hedge fund and private equity, that their labor is working, and they get a capital gains rate on their work as opposed to on their capital.
Right.
So that's just, and it's just, there's just all kinds of things that are unfair. I remember when just looking at one thing after another, you look at healthcare, and the biggest tax preference in the individual tax system is the deduction for employee-provided health care. And so why is it fair if I work for a well-heeled company that's got a gold-plated plan that they get a deduction and I don't pay any tax, but that the construction worker or the waitress or whatever doesn't get that? And as opposed
John
to...
McCain ran on getting rid of that deduction in 2008 and got hammered by Obama for it, and then Obama came in and implemented part of that.
Yeah, but I remember
Policy.
when we put it out there, we thought maybe the Democrats would embrace it, and they didn't. But there are all sorts of things, and so the corporate tax is to raise $300 billion. That's probably as expensive $300 billion as you're going to raise when you look at all the distortions in that and how unfair it is. And one of the things I learned, and I saw it from a different side as Treasury Secretary, that I realized why business doesn't get a better system is because if you talk at 100,000 feet, they all agree. But when you get to change it, they're all lobbying for their special preference. One man's loophole or one company's is the other is just what they essentially need and fight for it. And so it's craziness. But yeah, the tax system.
Well, that's the stuff that Trump's going to get rid of because he's strong.
Yeah. But
And smart.
I still think it is. We could easily, not politically, the thing that I found is in Washington there's no low-hanging fruit. Some things are analytically simple, like Social Security, and they're politically complex. I happen to think that the tax system, it should be analytically simple to solve some of these problems, but it's politically complex. We should be able to have a tax system that lets us raise the money we need and grow at a better rate, but we don't. There's all kinds of things. Mortgages. Why should someone be able to deduct interest on $1 million mortgage or whatever? And how do we
Because
get?
housing is the American dream.
Yeah, the American dream. But what about renters? And why is that fair to them? And so there's just it's very, very hard though to change this.
Sheila, let me ask you a question about a big public spectacle we've seen the last couple of days. The Pope has been in town, and he's had a couple of messages that are bracing. There is in the Pope's message things for both sides of the political divide to hold on to, whether it's on abortion rights. The Republicans like his message. On the economy, he's been very critical of the excesses of capitalism. Rush Limbaugh said on his radio broadcast that his economic views are pure Marxism. You're a Republican who's experienced in government. Is the Pope a Marxist?
Yeah, no, no, I don't think the Pope is a Marxist. I mean, I have no idea what his political beliefs are, but I don't interpret his statements as Marxist. I think he speaks more to the culture of the financial industry, and I think that's a concern I share. It's probably a concern Hank shares. I mean, what happened in 2009 with the bonuses? I think we were all very concerned that some, not everybody, you can't categorize everyone, but some people have lost their compass a bit on what the financial system is supposed to be, which is a means to an end. So it's the real economy is what the financial system is supposed to support, not the other way around. So I think speaking to the cultural issues and putting the financial system in appropriate context is helpful, and I think it's helpful for the industry to hear as well. But that's how I interpret his remarks, not that he's advocating any kind of communist takeover or anything like that.
Hank, the Pope has also been very outspoken on the issue of climate change. He explicitly endorsed at the White House what the president's done with his clean power plan to cap carbon emissions. As I've been running around in the presidential campaign so far, I have not found any appetite among Republican candidates to embrace anything like what the president's doing. As Marco Rubio told me a few weeks ago, we can't destroy our economy based on some unproven belief that climate change is happening, and B, it will be totally fruitless for the United States to do anything because the rest of the world isn't doing anything at all. And I just wonder whether you think the impact of the Pope's message may have an effect on your party at some point, or is that not likely to happen?
I don't know. I think what's ultimately going to affect the politicians is going to be the voters. And I could tell when I was Treasury Secretary and you name the state for me or the district, and I could tell you where the elected official would be on climate. You know, you could take a liberal senator, Jay Rockefeller from West Virginia, and after he lost the first election, he saw the light and realized that he was going to support coal. And so I think you have to educate the public. And the argument that I make when I speak to Republicans is this: that when you look at science and you look at the risks, climate change, I happen to be a conservationist, but it is an economic risk. It is a huge economic risk. And you have to be pretty sure that you're right to not want to take out insurance. When you look at some of the outcomes that are possible. Now, and I explained to Republicans, because as I've gone around, I think there's sort of three reasons why people, some thoughtful people don't want to do anything here. There's some that are selfish. You know, this is generational equity. We do better when there's an immediate crisis, right? You know, with the financial crisis, you know, the system was ready to collapse, and there the government can come in at the last minute and avoid the worst outcomes. Climate, of course, is much more pernicious because it's global, you know, and it's not national, and it's cumulative, and so it's not immediate, but the longer you wait, you know, the bigger the risk is and your less ability to deal with it. So one is people are a little bit selfish sometimes. Another is, you know, ignorance, but the third one is what I've heard some of the Republicans say, is to say, well, how can we act alone? You know, it's global. We'll do something. It'll hurt our competitiveness, but what about China?
To that point, I talked to Carly Fiorina last weekend, and she said, look, she didn't dispute the science. That wasn't her point. Her point was, well, the smart people on global warming tell us it will take a multi-trillion-dollar effort over 30 years to do something about this problem. Well, guess what? That is ridiculous. Anybody with a brain knows that we cannot get other countries, including China, to cooperate with us. Therefore, we should not try to do what Obama's doing.
So I tell you, one of the reasons why I spend as much time as I do in China is dealing with these big environmental issues. And I believe that we can't solve this unless we get, the rollout of new clean technologies in developing countries. I happen to believe that China is very serious about dealing with this. I happen to think that the agreement that President Obama and Xi Jinping, or the announcement they made in November, was historic.
It's real. It's not just a piece of paper.
Well, it's not binding, but I'll tell you, I don't think the Chinese say something like that lightly. They're taking it very seriously. I've seen it on a first-hand basis, and it's tough, and it's going to make it a lot easier, when President Obama announces the things that I hope they'll be announcing in the next couple of days. When he's sitting down with Modi from India on Monday, it'll be easier to do things there. I think one way to look at climate change is this. I chaired with Mike Bloomberg and with Tom Steyer this risky business study, where we looked at economic impact throughout a range of different outcomes using the best science, drilled down by geographical region in the U.S. and looked at what this could mean. And what you see is this, that no matter what we do, it's already baked into the cake that there's a range of things that are going to happen over the next 20 or 30 years here. And there's a lot we all should be doing in terms of to protect economic security, in terms of where plants are located, where building is done, the kinds of supply chains you build. And there's a real role for business to implement that, look at climate risk along with all other kinds of risks when they look at their decision making. To avoid the very worst outcomes, the only way you can avoid the worst outcomes are to get global action. And, Carly's right in one sense, in that it's a very vicious risk because it's global and it's not immediate. So that makes it more difficult. But when I look at the stakes here and what we're talking about in terms of what this means, I think it's incredible. But if I had 2 minutes with the Pope, I would applaud him for the climate change, but I would also ask him what role he thinks population is going to play in all of this, and when we go from 6 billion to 9 billion people on this planet, what that might do to the environment and climate change. So I think there's another argument that could be added to that.
Sheila, I'm sure that you would get at least as much time with the Pope as Hank. So if that's the case, how would you use your 2 minutes?
Oh my gosh, I probably would be speechless for 2 minutes. I'm an admirer of his. I like what he's saying. I don't think he's a communist. I think he's doing what he should do. He's a moral figure, a moral compass for the world, and that he's giving voice to a lot of these issues, I think is great. So I probably would just cheer him on, I'm afraid.
And I feel the same way, and I'm delighted with what he's said about climate change. I just think population is another issue out there that is a very serious issue.
Related question to the Pope's message, and it has to do with expanding economic opportunity in the country. Our politics is more polarized by race than at any time in my lifetime. And that affects the outcomes of decisions on government programs and tax and spending levels and what's done about education and what sort of opportunities services are provided. I wonder what your perspective is on how entrenched those divisions are becoming at a time when the Republican Party is overwhelmingly white party, the Democratic dominance of the non-white vote, and the growth of that vote is what's giving them the upper hand in presidential politics. It seems to me like a dangerous situation for the country, and I wonder what you think can be done about it.
Yeah, no, I think it is. You're seeing increasing polarization. And it's unfortunate because I do think both parties have a message for African-American families in particular who have done, all the data show that they have suffered the most. They suffered the most from the subprime crisis. African-American neighborhoods were targeted by subprime mortgage originators. Those neighborhoods are still deeply underwater. real income loss has been the worst in African-American families. So there is a good reason why there should be disaffectation there. I do think there are certain members of the Republican Party or claim to be Republicans who I think it's atrocious, some of the things they say, but I think there are others who truly think they have economic policies that can bridge the divide and reach all populations and help
Who are you
those that
talking
have hurt
about,
the
and
most.
do you think that
Well-
they're right about their policies?
Well, I haven't endorsed anyone, and I think, and probably won't, but I do think, I think Jeb Bush is absolutely sincere. I think he wants a diverse party. My old boss, Bob Dole, very much a Lincoln Republican when he chaired the RNC, when he ran for president, and when he served as vice president, this was always the top priority for him. So I think there are people in the Republican Party who embrace that. John Kasich, I think, is another one. I think Chris Christie has programs. They want to grow the economy in a way that's going to benefit the people who have not benefited. And as a Republican, it concerns me that we still have this tag of, the party of the wealthy and don't care about anybody else. And there may be a few out there who have those views, but I don't think the people I consider the mainstream candidates, I don't think have that view. And I hope people will open their minds and hearts to their arguments. They may or may not be good, but I would like to see the Democrats have a little competition for those votes. I think it's very unhealthy right now.
One more question, and then I'm going to go to some questions in the audience. When you were the Treasury Secretary, did you use a treasury.gov email account?
No, I will say this, very, very interesting, but I was what you call a late bloomer. I'm embarrassed about this with technology. So I did not have a BlackBerry or an iPhone, and I did things, I think I sent maybe one email once, which I dictated or one or two that I dictated to my assistant who did that. So I never sent emails, and when I left Treasury, I was about a year out.
So you did not have a homebrew server?
Yeah, I didn't have anything. I didn't have anything. But I sure, as you know, there was complete transparency because all my phone logs were there. But I learned to use to send email about a year or two after I left.
Smart. Serious question, though, actually. Do you think that this controversy, this furor about Hillary Clinton's emails is actually worth the attention it's getting, or is it your suspicion that this is much ado about not that much?
It's my decision that I'm not going to make news here on that. That's my decision. But how can you not be for transparency? And so I never. It was an issue, literally, that I never had to deal with or think about. But
Did you have a homebrew server?
No,
Yeah.
I used FDIC.gov. No, I was, and I, unlike Hank, I did everything by email. And I apologize to my new family that you probably get too many emails from me. I found it a very convenient way to communicate. And actually, I got worried after, we went through this terrible crisis, and we had to make some quick decisions, and a lot of controversial decisions, and then all the predictable congressional investigations started, and everybody's going through everybody's emails, and I'm thinking, I had thousands of them out there. I thought, oh my gosh, somebody's going to find something out of context. And actually, it helped, because I had contemporaneous explanations of everything we were doing. So actually, it ended up helping that I did all this email, but I always used FDIC.gov.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to go to questions in the audience. And the first question, I'm going to call on Jessica Cornwall from the class of 19. Is Jessica here? If she's not here, I will read her question.
Hello. Do you think that economic growth and environmental protection require a trade-off? And if so, how do you balance the need for economic growth with environmental stewardship?
Hank?
Well, it's interesting. And I write about that, Jessica, in the book on China, because when I made my first environmental speech in China in 1999, I was trying to make the case, which I sincerely believe, that that the only way you can build any kind of prosperity is lasting prosperity in the longer term. And there, the two are same, opposite sides of the same coin. And that what you find is that until a country has gotten a certain amount of economic success, they don't make the investments they need to make to maintain the environment. And of course, if they hit the environment, if they hurt the environment, their economic growth isn't going to be sustainable. And that's what China is seeing right now. And so a big part of what the Paulson Institute does in China with our air quality and climate programs and so on, working there is to really to make that case and actually show people how to implement it, because it's there are trade-offs. Climate is a harder trade-off because there's been all these studies that show that try to show that obviously investing in reducing carbon emissions makes great economic sense, and it does if you look for the long term. But there are dislocations. Some people pay more now and others benefit later. Certain industries benefit, others are hurt. So there are dislocations. But as a general proposition, I believe that the two go together. And I lived through it in this country where, we're at the time of the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. And that was before I was in business, but I was in school or in early days of government. And I heard business screaming that was going to hurt. It was going to hurt our competitiveness. And guess what? It enhanced it. And so, I think the two can be balanced.
Okay. Now, Sheila didn't want me to go pop culture, Kardashian, that kind of thing on my selection of questions, but I can't resist this one because there's just too much sex in this question. Emily Summers, class of 16. You here? Go for it.
Hi, I'm an economics and business management double major. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the future environment for international banking and whether you think that the Basel Committee plays a sufficient role in setting regulatory standards at this point in time.
As you can tell, it was the Basel Committee that got me.
Well, as a former member of the Basel Committee, Hank you lucky person, you were spared that.
Well, you were,
'Cause
that was one of the first meetings, I don't
Yeah, it was,
remember.
yeah.
When you and I, you were right. You came over, remember?
Yeah, I do
Really,
remember. I begged you for help.
Yeah, that's right.
So this goes back to something called the Basel II Advanced Capital Standards, which was a very misguided effort to let very large banks heavily influence their minimum capital requirements by using their own internal models, which they could adjust, obviously. So it created a lot of bad incentives. It was implemented for investment banks. We held it back for commercial banks. And unfortunately, because we stopped it for commercial banks, they didn't take on a lot of additional leverage, where you saw with some of the investment banks. So I was and the FDIC played a big role in that, and Treasury was helpful. Bob Steele was helpful in that. Well, you understood. I mean, I'll never forget, I went over to Steele to ask for help. I was isolated on this, so it was the FDIC against the Fed and all the other banking regulators. So I went to the Treasury for help. And the whole theory of the Basel II advanced approaches was the good times were going to last forever. The banks had mastered risk management, and they knew they didn't need much capital anymore. And I'll never forget Bob Steele said, well, either that's true or the big one is coming. And he was right. The big one was coming. So we stopped it. But yeah.
As we said, I never know a banker that got in trouble by having too much capital.
Yeah, exactly.
And yet they still, of all the, there's, when you look at regulation of banks today, I think we needed better, not as opposed to more, and we've got some of both. So some stuff we've got we don't need. But the thing that I have the biggest objection to is when they complain about having to have too much capital.
I agree.
And I say, like, where were you, 10 years ago? So I'm...
This is what I hear constantly on the campaign trail. Republican candidates especially say, banks can't make loans anymore because of Obama administration regulation through Dodd-Frank.
Yeah, I would say in terms of Dodd-Frank, and Barney Frank absolutely, wrote a foreword in the paperback edition of my book, because we had put out Bob Steele worked with me on this and a number of others, some suggestions for regulatory reform, actually before the crisis hit in full. And a good number of the things were adopted in Dodd-Frank. Now, I think Dodd-Frank, there are parts of it, and Sheila lived through it a lot more than I did, but there are parts of it that to me make no sense. But I think overall, we got the major things we needed. It was a big improvement.
I agree, yeah.
And part of the problem with Dodd-Frank is that Congress is so dysfunctional and there's so many regulators fighting with each other that you can't make the technical corrections and other things they'd like to make. I see
Yeah.
you.
No, I think that's true, and I think the international community complicates it. So the Basel Committee, that's a very time-consuming process. We did finally get capital standards up, but it took a 2008 financial crisis to do it, and they've been mostly implemented in the U.S. I'd like to see them even higher, but it's a significant improvement. But in Europe, because they have this bureaucratic way of implementing the rules, they haven't even really started, because the rules, they have to go through various layers, and the individual countries actually have to write the rules that legislatures have to, and then the regulators have to implement them. So if it ever is actually fully implemented, will surprise me. I think the European Central Bank, they have the single supervisory mechanism now. So countries in the Eurozone, for the large ones, they will have the ECB now as their regulator. So through the supervisory process, not through rulemaking, which is what the Basel Committee is about, but through the supervisory process, actually going in and examining banks, stress testing them, you'll probably get the capital levels up that way. But it is distressing, because something like capital, where there's such a clear consensus, we needed much stronger standards. Even with this terrible crisis, it's really taken the international regulatory community a long time to implement them.
You just brought to mind a question, sort of big picture question. You talked about how European regulators haven't implemented their standards yet. Everything's relative, and we know tremendous amount of criticism of Washington and the way the system works. When you step back and think about, in general or specifically in management and regulation of the economy, do politics and government work better here or work better in Europe?
It works better here. Oh, absolutely.
Better here.
No question.
agree with that?
Oh,
Yeah.
it isn't
yeah.
even close.
Yeah.
It is.
So stop complaining.
Well, that's not to give us a vibe. We could do a lot better,
but
yeah.
if you want to be, I don't mean to sound too negative, but one of the issues we're going to have is when you look at big economies around the world, you look at Europe and you look at their structural problems and how hard it is to make the changes. China has got a very, very different political system, but they're going to have trouble making the kinds of changes they need to make. Look at what Japan, Brazil. I mean, so it's very difficult. And of course, the big structural issues in Europe around the EU, the monetary union, where rather than the countries coming together, there's more nationalism and pulling it apart. And then you look at all the regulation and the labor laws and so on. So yeah, our system is. Yeah.
Well, I just asked that because maybe it's defense mechanism, since I'm a kid who grew up inside the Beltway, but it seems to me that people endlessly bash how badly Washington works, and if we're actually doing better than other major industrial countries in the world, we ought to take note of that.
Yeah, we should. We are doing better. We've got fewer problems than others, but I happen to think a lot of that has to do with how large and diverse our economy is, the American people, what you see going on in certain cities and states. I am seriously concerned because our system has been designed to make it very difficult to make structural changes, and when the world is changing as quickly as it is, I'm concerned that I'd like to see us, I think we could do so much better, and I'm afraid we will do so much worse if we don't make those changes, and we don't figure out how to compromise.
All right, another student question that is going to put Sheila's ability to bring home the bacon to the test. Brad Janoka, class of 16.
All the way back here. I can just call it out if you want.
It's okay with me.
All right. So I'm a senior, so that means in the next few months, Sally Mae is going to come kick down my door.
Yeah.
really huge. I mean, we have an entire generation of professionals who are starting off with debt. And I wonder what this country, but even more specifically what Washington College can do to reduce the debt of its future students.
Yeah.
It's on you.
Well, so no, I mean, I'm glad, I welcome that question because this is a very big priority for me and something I'll be talking about on Saturday when I'm formally inaugurated. I think in terms of what the school can do, we'll do, I think Washington College already has done a good job of trying to hold the line in cost and hold back tuition increases. We will continue that and try to make sure we're as efficient as we can be and understand that every additional dollar we spend, it's got to come from somewhere. And we need to make sure that we don't overly burden our students. The other thing we need to do is put a razor-like focus on philanthropy for scholarship funding. So when students come here, if they can't meet the tuition cost, that they can get scholarship funding as opposed to having to go out to borrow. And so that is a big thrust of mine already. We're redirecting our Washington Fund, our annual giving fund, towards scholarship funding. We're going to be launching a couple of campaigns. One called George's Brigade for students of need, and another broader one called Dam the Debt, DAM, little double entendre, but to try to erect a dam against
I
this.
saw what you did
Yeah,
there.
okay. But you know, this is not, so students of need obviously are a key concern, but you know, tuition costs have gotten so high, and this is true across the country, that middle class, even upper middle class families are struggling. So I think those are the kinds of things that Washington College could do. I think in Washington, they need to get smarter about how we're spending our federal aid. It makes me sick to see how some of these, there are some good for-profit schools, there are a lot of others who have completely ripped off taxpayers by heavily recruiting students just to get the student loan money, not giving them educations that are worth anything if the kids even are steered towards a degree. And those, you know, I think they're like 10% of the students and over 40% of the defaults in this country. And those debt levels are very high, and those tend to be the lower income kids. So nationwide, this is also driving higher student debt costs. I think it's also symptomatic in terms of root causes, back to your first question about the unevenness of the economic recovery and growing income disparities. So we have a very complex, globalized economy right now. You really need a college degree to navigate it. It's what a high school degree used to be. You need to have a college degree now. So there's a greater demand for kids to get a college degree, but less income capability in their families because of declining real wages. So colleges have been confronted with a greater financial need combined with a greater demand for a college degree. And I think a lot of the tuition increases, now I'm not talking about here, but the national trend, they have been ratcheting up tuition, hoping that the upper income families can support it to subsidize the increasing need of the lower income students and middle income students. And it's been self-defeating because as you raise tuition, more kids need help. So we're going to be taking a close look at how we charge for tuition, how we deal with increased tuition needs if we need to raise revenue. But most of all, a very, very vigorous push on scholarship funding. So kids do not have to borrow. We're going to keep the line on cost, but we're going to do everything we can to refocus philanthropy towards scholarship.
Sheila, let me just ask you about two related policy proposals that are out there right now. One is President Obama has proposed that 2 years of community college should be
Right.
free.
Right.
Bernie Sanders has gone further and proposed that students should be able to go free of tuition to public universities in their states.
Right.
What do you think of the merits of those two ideas?
Well, I think they sound, we spend a lot of money already on student financial aid, and I think they don't, the other side of this is accountability. And to be fair to the for-profits, there are a lot of community colleges out there who have also not done as good a job. There's some wonderful community colleges, I think most of them are, but there are some who have not. And so I do worry about lack of accountability and incentives if there's no discipline of having to charge at all for anybody, whether that is going to be a prudent use of taxpayer dollars. I want to make sure that kids have access to affordable education. I also want to make sure they get an education that's worth something for them, so when they graduate, they can get a decent job. So just throwing money at it without addressing the accountability part of it and making sure that whatever it costs them, it's a degree of value, I think you're only really tackling half the problem and potentially making it worse.
Hank, a related question about not so much a specific proposal, but a sentiment expressed by one of the candidates. Hillary Clinton, when she gave a speech not long ago, said, finance plays too big a role in our economy. It ought to be smaller. Plays too big a role at the expense of manufacturing real things and making real products, et cetera. Trump has talked a little bit about that. He talked about all the paper pushers on Wall Street. Do you think that that is, at its core, a correct statement?
Yeah, I think it's a dangerous statement because people keep wanting these manufacturing jobs to come back. And I did a lot of work on that when I was at Treasury. And basically you saw that we had, the U.S. right now is either the first or the largest manufacturer in the world in terms of, maybe the second largest in terms of physical output. And we have the same number of people in manufacturing today as we had, in 1950, but they have 8 times the output. And so when you walk through a manufacturing plant, you don't see workers, you see robotics. And so
They have 8 times the output and half the pay.
yeah, right. And so much so when people say we want to make things, there are all kinds of service industries right now, and that's what China needs to develop. China is in big trouble because they don't have a finance industry. And so I would start and say that if you look at finance broadly in the United States of America, from venture capital in Silicon Valley, through private equity, through all of the investors we have, to the banks, investment banks, we have the broadest, deepest, most competitive, best financial system in the world. And anyone else would like to have that system. It's better capitalized, better regulated, the best capital system. When you look at the size of our banking system relative to our GDP, it is much more in line with it than Europe, where you had the banks 3-4 times the GDP. The issue that I think is a concern, and one Sheila spent a lot of time thinking about, and I spent a lot of time thinking about, is a concentration. And we took a bad situation and made it worse in terms of the size. So when you look at the percentage of the financial system that is, in 8, 9, 10 institutions, it's very concentrated. But I happen to think that, Wall Street is a favorite whipping boy, and particularly after, and when you go through these crises, and I say this not because I was a former banker, I really don't.
Speaking of that, by the way, the whipping boy, when I talked to Ted Cruz a couple of months ago and asked whether or not the bailout that was initiated under your tenure and continued under President Obama was not in the national interest to prevent a depression, he said, no, it's crony capitalism.
Yeah, people, that's an easy thing to say, and if you know nothing about finance, it's really easy. But I will say this: the root cause of, since the beginning of time, as long as you have governments and banks, you'll have financial crises, because you'll have flawed government policies, the bankers will make mistakes, and you go back, you look, we talked about China, you look at the overseas Chinese, and what would happen in China when they'd have financial crises, they'd kill the bankers. You look, and so what happens is...
Good plan, bad plan.
Well, people want to do it here, but the bankers always are going to make mistakes, but we make a mistake if we blame it all on the bankers and say we just have to get the bankers, because we got to look at the policies. And what were the policies that create the bubbles? What were the policies that encouraged Americans to, when Wendy and I built our home in 1974, you know, the average American home was 1,800 square feet, you know, and now they're much, much bigger than that. And we have programs that encouraged Americans to look at their home as just not a place to live, not shelter, but an investment. And look at, because, and so the politicians that create all the policies or the screwed up regulatory system, which is beyond belief, and then when something goes wrong, they say, well, it's just the bankers. So it's easy for any politician to say this because, you know, that's what the American public believes, you know, by and large. I looked at some polls when I left, which weren't fun for me to look at, that showed that TARP was more unpopular than torture, you know. and yet people in the same poll.
Did that feel like waterboarding to you?
Oh, yeah. I'm sure it ranked worse than waterboarding. And yet people in the same poll, when you asked them what they were most concerned about, it was, you know, that they were worried about, was there going to be another depression?
Yeah.
Sheila, let me go back to the core question that I started with Hank on, which is that, is he right that finance is appropriately sized for the economy, or do we have too many financial engineers and not enough real engineers?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. I think the market's very distorted right now. I think the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank does this annual bailout barometer, I think they call it, that shows how what percentage of federal liabilities in the financial sector are guaranteed by the government. It's up to like 70%. So if you add all the guaranteed mortgages, all the guaranteed small business loans, the deposit insurance, I mean, some of those I think you probably need, but if you add it all up, and I wonder, I don't think we need all these mortgage subsidies, you add it all up, the government's guaranteeing about 70% of financial activity, so of course it's too big if the government is subsidizing. I think we're talking about different things.
If you look at Fannie and Freddie, I mean, you and I could talk with the Federal Home Loan Bank and Fannie and Freddie and all that. So I could find all kinds of problems in the financial system, and I just think it's appalling,
Yeah, well,
appalling.
and my only point was that the government has distorted that, so we don't really know what the right size of the financial sector is because of all these government subsidies. I would agree with Hank, we're in a global economy, whether we want it to believe it or not, we do need some institutions of size. I tend to think they could be smaller and still serve the needs of the real economy, but there again, the so-called too big to fail subsidy, which is still, we've done a lot to reduce that, but it's still out there. That's another implicit government support that can distort the size of the financial sector.
Let me ask each of you a question that, I don't mean to be a political question because he's on the way out and it's not on the ballot this time, but I wonder how each of you, as Republicans, but realistic thinkers about the economy, how would you evaluate the 7 years of President Obama in terms of his seeing clearly what our economic problems are, having some rough idea about what to do about them, and trying to pursue those goals?
I don't personalize this, so I'll just talk about the economy very, very quickly. And I'll say, first of all, I think, as Steve said, there was a smooth path between administrations. I think that I'd look at it, and if you just look at the numbers, I believe that the capital market stabilization programs were in place. The programs that spent 95% of the dollars were in place, 75 of them had gone out. I think that early on, I sat there, when I left the administration, I had my heart in my throat because he did what any new president would coming in. His supporters didn't want him to go with the same programs we had. They were debating nationalizing the banks, and so on. But the team, he had Tim Geithner as his Treasury Secretary. Sheila was there. Ben was there. They basically ran those programs well. The stimulus got put in place. That you can argue about it, but I think stimulus was needed. We can argue about things with bank reform, but by and large, we got the authority to wind down, failing non-banks, so all of that is good. After that, I would simply say I was disappointed that Bowles-Simpson, that we did see a leader.
Equalized investment income and labor income tax
Yeah.
rates, I might say.
That's right. And so basically, I'm just trying to think what else was done with the economy other
Yeah,
than that.
I agree, yeah.
I think basically then it's the
Well,
Fed.
you had the fiscal cliff deal, which raised rates on people over 400,000, put them back to the old rates.
So the fiscal, I don't think you could argue that grew the economy, and I don't think you could argue that that solved the fiscal problem. So I don't think we've dealt with the fiscal problem.
What about on climate?
So in climate, I am a big fan, okay? You can't sit where I am. If I sincerely believe that this is the biggest economic risk we face, and we're talking about life on this planet as we know it, and I care about these generational issues. That's why I care about entitlements. I think that my generation can be accused of being a very selfish generation. When you look at where we spend our money on people, the health care in the last few years of their life, and what we're not doing investing in the future and in education. When I look at these, I look at the environmental issues as being, and I would say this, I'm really excited when I look at the environmental programs and some of the things this college is doing. But so when I look at, so I'm very, very positive about
Well,
the climate.
related question you just brought to mind about healthcare spending at the end of life. The Affordable Care Act was something that was projected by many Republicans to have a devastating future impact on the economy. Has it?
Well, no, I don't think, first of all, I'm not a healthcare expert. I haven't really commented on that before. I would just say the following. I always thought that someday we were going to need to and should extend coverage to those that weren't covered. It never occurred to me we would do that without getting fundamental reform. I thought that was going to be the trade. I thought that was going to be the trade. And so all the numbers, I think you have to be careful to be fooled by saying the deficit's coming down. Of course, the deficit's coming down after the crisis and when all the money's, coming back. If you look at the structural issues out there in terms of, it's not a pretty picture. And so I think we've missed an opportunity. And I think there was a moment when there was a real opportunity with Simpson Bowles to do some things that are fundamental. So was I disappointed we didn't do this? But I'm not, I'm Republican. I'm not at all partisan. And there's a lot that the president is doing and with China and around the world. And the thing that I'm most grateful for is I really believe that there was great policy continuity between administrations when we really needed it. So although we were sitting there and getting our brains beaten out, those of us that had left being criticized, they were taking the policies and continuing them. And I think that's the best reasonable case. And I'll tell you, some of the things I heard people on the other side saying at the time, I'm very grateful.
Sheila, it sounds like Hank's grade is not perfect, some missed opportunities, but not too bad.
Yeah.
What's yours?
Well, I would agree. I think history will treat him well. I think there have been some significant pieces of legislation that have been passed. I think both healthcare and Dodd-Frank, and again, I'm also not an expert on healthcare, but I think they were more layering onto the current systems where perhaps it would have been better to fundamentally change, but we didn't do that. But they're both improvements. I don't think anybody can take that away. I had my disagreements with some of his economic team, and it saddens me that we didn't. I think there are two areas where I think could really get our economy going, and I hope still that the next administration will pursue them. I think you can absolutely do it on a bipartisan basis. One is tax reform, broadening the base and getting the top rates down, both the corporate and the personal.
Corporate in particular, or both?
I think both. I think both, but more urgently corporate. I'm on the board of a couple of publicly traded corporations. One's Canadian, one's U.S., and the complexities of our U.S. tax code are horrifying, and they affirmatively give you incentives to move. It's
I'd say
crazy.
don't put words in my mouth. What I said was, I can't think of
my job.
I can't think of what's been done. I think the way that the crisis was handled. But as I said earlier, I don't think it's right having, 2% growth. And so there's a whole lot of things I'd like to have seen done in terms of fundamental tax reform, in terms of a different approach to health care, in terms of dealing with the budget. And basically what I said was, I think coming out of the crisis and the continuity of the capital market stabilization programs, I think is very good. I'm very positive on climate change. But I don't, what I was trying to tactfully say, I don't know what else has been done other than raising tax rates. And I think we could.
It's on their shoulder.
You see, I was a little bit animated here. So I think what we need, and what we really need in this country, is we need a leader. It's not going to be easy to pull people together. And just remember, when you're elected to Congress, you represent your party. There's one person that represents the United States of America, and that person has got to sometimes lean against the wind and do things that his party doesn't want to do to bring things together. So, I'm grateful that the economy is doing better than a lot of other places in the world, but I think we could be doing better.
I would just like to close the session, because we're out of time, with a personal observation related to what Hank was saying, which is, if you follow the presidential campaign, all you hear are very downbeat assessments of how government doesn't work, how Washington doesn't work. But I was struck by, and I wrote this story, I think it was in the height of the sort of anti-Washington feeling in 2010 or 2011, that we just, in fact, lived through a period where government actually did work. And I'm talking about the late 2008, 2009 period, when the chips were down, we were staring at down the barrel of something really, really dangerous for our country and the world, and people like George Bush, Hank Paulson, Sheila Bair, Ben Bernanke, and then Tim Geithner and Larry Summers and Barack Obama did what was needed to be done to prevent a calamity for the country and the world. And while we point to all the things that don't work, I think it's worthwhile to point to the things that do work in a pinch. And so I invite you to applaud these two.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to stay one more minute. I have a little surprise before we wrap up the evening, and to announce that surprise, it is my privilege to introduce the chair of our Board of Visitors and Governors, H. Lawrence Culp, Jr. Larry Culp recently stepped down as Danaher Corporation's CEO and president to become a senior advisor following a nearly 14-year run during which revenues and market cap increased approximately fivefold under his tenure to $20 billion and $50 billion, respectively. He's one of our most distinguished alums, a true powerhouse in corporate America. In his so-called retirement, Larry has joined the faculty of the Harvard Business School as senior lecturer focused on strategy and general management. He is also an alum of Harvard Business School, like Hank. In addition, he serves as the chair of our board here, obviously, as well as he's on the board of trustees of Wake Forest, and most recently joined the board of T. Rowe Price Group in Baltimore. Please join me in welcoming Larry Culp, who will have a special announcement.
Thank you, Sheila. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Board of Visitors and Governors, I would like to extend our welcome to you for the beginning, obviously, what will be a series of events to celebrate Sheila's inauguration. And what a kickoff we've just had. Could we have another round of applause for our guests? Sheila will be inaugurated on Saturday. but as many of you know, she joined us officially on the 1st of August. And I hope whether you've had another opportunity elsewhere to visit with her or are being introduced to her today for the first time, you're beginning to get a sense of why those of us on the board are so excited that she's here. I think you heard that through a career of public service, she really has not only had unique experiences, but has demonstrated uncommon wisdom and real courage in leadership. And all of that, I think, will come to bear on her presidency at Washington College. In the short time that she's been here, we've had an opportunity to get started, and I can already see the things that Hank told me about Sheila some months ago. A tireless work ethic, incredible energy, and you can ask Sheila where she's been this week, just as further evidence of that. Real vision as to what's possible, but not with her heads in the clouds. She has a real bias for action, and I think that's so exciting for us, particularly at this juncture in the college's history. And I also add that she's a regular person, uncommon in Washington as well. She's warm, she's funny, and I wouldn't have said this unless you admitted it, she's very good at email. With all due respect, Hank, to Senator Cruz, as a corporate leader at the time of the crisis, I know all of us who were running companies, manufacturing companies, and other entities were just so comfortable that you were taking the time that you were to serve the country. Many of you will remember that it was a scary time. And those of us who make things in the real world knew that we had in Hank Paulson, someone at the helm at Treasury, who knew how the real world worked and was able, with others, as John said, to take the economy, take our country through the crisis in a way that I think has set us up quite well going forward. It's our custom, Hank, at Washington College to honor contemporary role models who emulate the qualities of our founding patron. So it does give me great pleasure, on behalf of the Board of Visitors and Governors, to authorize that the honorary degree, Doctor of Laws, the same degree conferred on General Washington himself 225 years ago, be conferred upon you today.
I told you it could happen.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, thank you. Oh.
It was in his retirement that our founding patron, George Washington, wrote to President Adams that Alexander Hamilton had been, quote, the principal and most confidential aide of the commander-in-chief. He also added that he is ambitious, I shall readily grant, but it is of that laudable kind which prompts a man to excel in whatever he takes in hand. He is enterprising, quick in his perceptions, and his judgment intuitively great. I have no doubt that if General Washington were here with us today, he would say much the same of you. So if I may read from the mandamus. It having been certified by the faculty to the visitors and governors of Washington College that Henry Hank Paulson, Jr. is of acknowledged eminence and distinction, has made worthwhile and noteworthy contributions to our society, and is therefore worthy to receive the highest honors, you are hereby authorized and directed, in accordance with the ordinance to that effect, to confer at the public symposium on September the 24th, 2015, to Henry Hank Paulson, Jr., honoris causa, the degree of Doctor of Laws, Environmental Studies, and Public Policy.
Oh, my God. I tell you, I tell you, I know Sheila's a woman of action, but I don't think anybody could figure out how to make me a doctor of law. So,
Well, we have full regalia here, and Hank, I am just so pleased that you are my very first honorary degree awardee, so here's your diploma.
thank you.
here is your hood. Should we put it on?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
We're good down? There you go. Very becoming.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay. So with that, I will now invite all of you to a reception in the Underwood lobby, just outside the door here, where we'll have an opportunity to mingle a bit with you before we proceed to the dinner. Thank you very much for coming.